Okay, so the last two videos I talked about politics and business and the economy. Now we're going to focus on culture, which is a huge part of the 1920s. I think I'm going to split this up into two so it doesn't end up being super long, so we'll see. The census of 1920 reported that for the first time, more than half of the American population lived in urban areas. So again, this is very different change over time, right? This is very different from when the U.S. began, and it was mainly agrarian. And we've been talking about that battle between agrarian and industrial for quite some time now. But by 1920, the majority of Americans lived in cities. The culture of these cities was based on popular tastes, morals, and habits of mass consumption that were increasingly at odds with the strict religious and moral codes of rural America. So this tension between rural and urban, modern and fundamental is not going to go away. Moralists of the 1920s blamed the automobile for the breakdown of morals, especially among the young. But soon they also added music, dancing, and movies and fashion to the breakdown of morals as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, or I am. I don't know why I keep saying we're. All right, so high school and college kids express their rebellion against their culture of their parents by dancing to jazz music. Brought north by African American musicians, jazz became a symbol of the new and modern culture of the cities. The proliferation or spread and popularity of phonographs and radios made this new style of music available to huge and mainly young audiences. And so this is why we call the time period the Jazz Age. Jazz music evolved from the songs slaves sang to one another while working in the field. These field songs oftentimes followed a call and response rhythm in order to pass the time or tell a story. The singer would call out a line, and the rest of the workers would repeat it. This music continued to evolve even after slavery, officially at least, ended. In the 1920s, as African Americans left the Jim Crow South, remember, again, we are through that time period of the Great Migration. African Americans are leaving the South and going up into northern cities to seek opportunities. They're taking their music with them, right? They're not just leaving culture. You don't leave your culture behind. The music quickly became popular with the masses. Artists like Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, and Duke Ellington became big names in the jazz world. P.S. I think HBO just made a movie about Bessie Smith starring Queen Latifah. I haven't seen it yet, but it is on my list of things to watch on Netflix. So if you've seen it, let me know. Check it out. Unfortunately, despite its mass appeal, many artists continued to face the burdens of discrimination. So even though people were listening to music that came out of Black culture, there was still very much a resistance to the concept of equality. Newspapers had once been the only medium of mass communication and entertainment. In the 1920s, though, a new medium, the radio, suddenly appeared. The first commercial radio station went on the air in 1920 and broadcasted music to just a few thousand listeners. But by 1930, there were over 800 stations broadcasting to 10 million radios, which was about a third of all U.S. homes. So a third of all U.S. homes, on average, by 1930, owned a radio. The organization of the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC, in 1924, and the Columbia Broadcasting Company, CBS, in 1927, provided networks of radio stations that enabled people from coast to coast to listen to the same programs. News broadcasts, sporting events, soap operas, quiz shows, and comedies were typically the type of things that people would tune in to listen to. We also see a rise in the movie industry. It becomes big business in the 1920s. Going to the movies became a national habit in city centers and small towns. Sexy and glamorous movie stars such as Greta Garbo and Rudolph Valentino were idolized by millions. Elaborate movie theater palaces were built for the general public. And with the introduction of talking pictures in the 1920s, in 1927, referred to as talkies, the movie industry reached new heights. By 1929, over 80 million tickets were sold to the latest Hollywood movies. Pictured here is one of the most famous theater palaces, Grauman's Chinese Theater, which opened in 1927. The theater is still open and still hosts premieres. Outside the theater is the famous Walk of Fame, which has celebrity hand and footprints captured in the concrete sidewalk. Yep, you can still see it. In an earlier era, politicians like William Jennings Bryan, Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson had been popularly viewed as heroic figures. But in the new age of radio and movies, Americans radically shifted their viewpoint and adopted this role models for larger-than-life personalities celebrated on the sports page and the movie screen. Every sport headed superstars who were nationally known. In the 1920s, people followed the knockout heavyweight boxer Jack Dempsey, the swimming records of Gertrude Adler. She was the first woman to swim across the English Channel. Americans also watched the home runs hit by Babe Ruth and the golf tournaments won by Bobby Jones. I didn't picture Bobby Jones here, but he's an important guy. But of all the popular heroes of the decade, the most celebrated was probably the young aviator who in 1927 thrilled the nation and the entire world by flying non-stop across the Atlantic from Long Island to Paris. Americans listened to the radio for news of Charles Lindbergh's flight and welcomed his return to the United States with a ticker tape parade larger than the welcome given to the returning soldiers of World War I. For those of you that may not be familiar with what a ticker tape parade is, so this is a parade down the center of New York, and it's called ticker tape because this would be the type of paper that was used by businesses in the stock market calculating numbers. And what they would do is they would toss out the ticker tape paper out of their windows as kind of like streamers, tossing streamers down to the parade below. So this parade, this ticker tape parade, which New York still hosts, was bigger for Charles Lindbergh than it was for the returning soldiers of World War I. So just to give you a little bit of an insight into how popular Charles Lindbergh was. He's pictured here with his famous airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. The passage of the 19th Amendment did not change women's lives for U.S. politics as women's lives and U.S. politics as much as had been anticipated. Voting patterns in the election of 1920 show that women did not vote as a bloc, like they weren't voting independently as women, but instead adopted the party preferences of their husbands and fathers. So remember, 1920 was the first presidential election in which women had the right to vote. The traditional separation of labor between men and women continued into the 1920s. Most middle-class women expected to spend their lives as homemakers and mothers. The introduction into the home of such labor-saving devices like the washing machine and vacuum cleaner eased but did not really change the daily routines of the homemaker. And just as a little aside, Melinda Gates of Bill and Melinda Gates and the Gates Foundation just recently released an article discussing how Americans in America and other countries, but typically in America, women still do 23% more housework than men do, and that's in 2016. So we're not seeing, in the 1920s certainly, there was not, this was not like an instantaneous revolution that happened. Participation of women in the workforce remained about the same as before the war. Employed women usually lived in the city and were limited to certain categories of jobs, typically referred to as pink-collar jobs because they were the jobs for women, like clerks, nurses, teachers, housekeepers, domestics, and they received lower wages than men did. The most significant change in the lives of young men and women in the 1920s was the revolt against sexual taboos. Women, some were influenced by the writings of the Austrian psychiatrist Sigmund Freud, who stressed the role of sexual repression in mental illness. If you ever read or learn about Freud in psychology, basically everything that he had to talk about revolved around sex. Rather interesting things he had to say about that, but that's a discussion for another day. Others, who mainly had never heard of Freud, still took to premarital sex as if it were like radio and jazz music, like it was one of the inventions of the modern age. Movies, novels, automobiles, and even new dance steps like the foxtrot and the Charleston also encouraged greater promiscuity. Here's a picture of the champions of the 1926 Charleston competition. Now, I realize that this may not look shocking to you, but this imagery horrified parents and fundamentalists and people in the older generation in the 1920s. The man's legs are open and he's bent over. The women's ankles and knees are exposed. Her hair is bobbed, it's cut short, and she's holding up her dress. Scandal, people. The use of contraceptives for birth control was still against the law in almost every state. But even so, the work of women like Margaret Sanger and other advocates of birth control achieved growing acceptance in the 1920s. A special fashion that set young people apart from older generations was the iconic flapper look. Influenced by movie actresses as well as their own desires, independent young women shocked their elders by wearing dresses hemmed at the knee instead of the ankle, and these dresses were looser than other dresses. They also did not require a corset. They bobbed their hair, meaning they cut it short, as was the style. They smoked cigarettes, and they drove cars, or were driven in cars more likely. They drove around in cars, took rides in cars. Not all women were flappers during this time period. I don't want you thinking that everybody is going around as a flapper, but a lot of high school and college graduates, this is appealing to them, especially the people that are in the cities. High school and college graduates also took office jobs until they were married. So women were entering the workforce and not just getting married right away. But then, as they married, women were still expected to abandon that flapper look and quit their jobs and settle down as wives and mothers. So we're seeing a little bit of a change in women's roles during this time period. As a result of the women's suffrage movement, state lawmakers were now forced to listen to feminists who demanded changes in the divorce laws to permit women to escape abusive and incompatible husbands. Liberalized divorce laws were one of the reasons that 1 in 6 marriages ended in divorce by 1930. This was a dramatic increase over the 1 in 8 ratio in 1920s. And by the way, this rise of divorce, the changing roles of women, the changing fashion, the dancing, the jazz music, this is all signs that the United States is going to hell in a handbasket, basically, to fundamentalists. So more on that in a second. Widespread belief in the value of education, together with economic prosperity, stimulated more state governments to enact compulsory state laws regarding education. So mandating that children attend school. Universal high school education became the new American goal. By the end of the 1920s, the number of high school graduates had doubled to over 25% of the school-age young adults. So that's a pretty big leap for education. All right, let's talk about literature and art, one of my favorite topics. Scorning religion as hypocritical and bitterly condemning the sacrifices of wartime as a fog perpetuated by money interests were two dominant themes of the leading writers of the post-war decade. This disillusionment caused the writer Gertrude Stein to call the writers of this time period the lost generation. The novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Sinclair Lewis, the poems of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, and Eugene O'Neill expressed disillusionment with the ideals of an earlier time and with the materialism of the business-oriented culture. Fitzgerald and the playwright Eugene O'Neill took to a life of drinking, while Eliot and Hemingway, by the way, Hemingway also very much took to a life of drinking. He was a renowned alcoholic. Well, he wouldn't call himself an alcoholic, he'd probably just call himself a drunk. Eliot and Hemingway expressed their unhappiness by moving into exile into Europe for a time. So again, these are people, this is a generation that had just gone through the worst war that the United States had ever experienced. They were questioning the reasons for that war, what could possibly justify so much death and destruction. They felt that in the end it was unjustified, that this was something that big business was behind, and that they also pointed to American consumerism and the changing morals and values of America and criticized those. So very interesting writing comes out of that. Many of you have read The Great Gatsby, which definitely points out American excess at this time period. So let's move on to art and architecture for a little bit. Again, we talk about art and architecture because it is letting us know what is going on in the nation at the time, how people are feeling. Influenced by the Art Deco and streamlined styles, people created functional products from toasters to locomotives that had aesthetic appeal. So it was visually pleasing. Many skyscrapers, such as the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building in New York, were also built in the Art Deco style. Now, these buildings weren't actually completed until the 30s, but because they're iconic buildings in the US and they represent the Art Deco style, that's why I chose to include them. The Art Deco style also captured modernists and classifications of forms while using machine age materials. And so you can also see this Art Deco example in the kitchen, the picture of the kitchen that I've chosen. I wonder if you guys can think of any Art Deco buildings or architecture and art that you have seen around Cairo. I know I've seen a few. The fusion of art and technology during the 1920s and 1930s created a new profession of industrial designers. Painters such as Edward Hopper were inspired by the architecture of American cities to explore the loneliness and isolation of urban life. Here is probably Hopper's most famous painting, titled Nighthawks. Can you see how Hopper translates the concept of loneliness into this painting? Regional artists such as Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton celebrated the rural people and scenes of the heartland of America. I'm sure many of you have seen Grant Wood's American Gothic, or at least seen replications of Grant Wood's American Gothic in popular culture. It's a very iconic painting. All right, now to the Harlem Renaissance. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to stop here because we're at 20 minutes. So I'm going to pause right here and then we'll go on to the Harlem Renaissance in the next video.